Hello, and welcome to The Story of Your Life. Today, we are going over Chapter 1 of the Lifespan Development textbook provided by OpenStax. You can find a link to the free textbook in the description below. All of the following information is directly from OpenStax Lifespan Development textbook and free resources online. Today, we're going over lifespan psychology and developmental theories. Let's start out by defining what psychology is. The scientific study of the mind and all the behavior it produces is psychology. That is a short and simple definition, but it covers nearly the entire range of human experience. It recognizes that the mind plays a central role in human functioning and is the origin of all behavior and the center of all our responses to our environment. Lifespan development and human development. The term lifespan development is another name for the subfield of developmental psychology. These terms describe the scientific study of growth, change, and stability in humans and the processes that underlie that growth and change from conception until death, or colloquially, womb to tomb. The human development perspective helps remind us that human development is complex and is best understood using as many tools, perspectives, and level of analysis as possible. The contemporary study of human growth, change, and stability across the lifespan has embraced this multidisciplinary perspective, whether it is called lifespan development or human development. Let's look at the history of lifespan development. French physician Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard conducted a case study of a boy who had spent his childhood without human contact. The case of Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron, continues to spark interest more than 2 centuries later. Through his work with Victor, Itard was able to begin exploring many of the fundamental questions that lifespan development concerns itself with today. We can trace the field of lifespan development to at least the start of the 19th century in Europe. Older roots lead back to ancient Greece around 400 BCE. Individuals like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and other philosophers were fascinated with the same questions that contemporary developmental psychologists study. Now turning to psychological domains of the developing individual. We have the 3 to the right, figure 1.4, biological/physical, cognitive, as well as social and emotional. Figure 1.4, the overlapping domains of development include an individual's biological/physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional processes. Going back toward the left of the screen, psychologists have devised a way to study developing individuals by looking at several major functional areas. Already have mentioned biological, cognitive, social, emotional, and personality. Now, please note that developmental psychology sometimes refers to social, personality, and emotional topics as psychosocial development, to highlight the way these areas overlap with cognition and mental processes. Continuous versus discontinuous development. When we observe a gradual day-by-day or week-by-week progression of change, we see continuous development. Think of it like an escalator of improvement over time. Many topics in the field of lifespan development show a continuous pattern of development. For example, vocabulary growth across the toddler and early childhood years shows a dramatic but smooth progression of growth in the number of words a child produces and comprehends. However, early psychological theorists such as Jean Piaget and Erik Erikson, whose work you'll learn about more throughout this course, noted that certain cognitive and personality characteristics seem to develop in intermittent fits and spurts or stages. This is discontinuous development, a change in developmental kind, form, or degree that does not directly follow what came before. Think of it as happening in unique stages. Stage 1 is separate from stage 2 to 3, and so on. Looking at figure 1.5 gives us a visual. In contrasting theories, development can be viewed as continuous or discontinuous. Continuous development, once again, is conceptualized as a gradual, ongoing process, like an escalator of improvement, whereas discontinuous development is marked by distinct stages from one another. Sources of developmental change. We now turn the theme for which developmental psychology is best known, the relationship between nature and nurture. You may also hear this referred to as the nature versus nurture debate. For most physical and psychological characteristics, the source for developmental change or stability is rarely nature or nurture alone. Instead, developmental psychologists focus on the complex and fascinating ways that nature and nurture combine and work together to direct change and stability across the lifespan. As a quick note of reference, nature is in regard to your genetic influences, what you receive from your biological parents, and your nurture is all the environmental influences in your life. That can still, of course, be your parents, that can be your friends, teachers, etc. But where the debate was nature versus nurture, it shouldn't be seen as a this versus that model. It should be viewed as an interactionist model, where both nature, your genetics, and nurture, your environment, influence how you behave as well as how you develop. Heritability. The extent to which the genetic component explains difference is called a heritability estimate. A good example of how nature and nurture both contribute is the timing of the onset of puberty. It is determined via the combined influence of nature and nurture, given that both biological determinants, nature like genes, and environmental elements, nurture like nutrition, can trigger its emergence. Closely related to our thinking about the relative contributions of nature and nurture is the concept of reaction range, as we can see in Figure 1.2. This is the idea that our genes likely set upper and lower levels for particular traits, behaviors, and abilities, as well as how sensitive these are to environmental forces. So looking at Figure 1.7, we have the reaction range and measured IQ. Although how the contributing factors combine in complex ways not fully understood, researchers agree that both genes and environment play roles in the development of intelligence. Gene-environment correlations. Gene-environment correlation describes the complex interplay between our genes and the environment and the environments we experience, and encompasses three main types: passive, evocative, and active. The passive type occurs when a child inherits genes from their parents that influence the environment in which they are raised. For example, parents who enjoy reading are more likely to read to their children regularly and have many books in the house. The evocative type explains how our genetically influenced behaviors can evoke reactions in others, shaping our environment in turn. For example, parents are more likely to take their child to the library if they notice the child enjoys reading. The active type refers to how our genetic tendencies guide us to select specific environments. For example, a child joins a book reading club at school because they have a passion for reading. Now let's look at epigenetics. The process of epigenetics explains how an individual's behavior and environment can cause changes that affect the way their genes work. Biologists, neuroscientists, and psychologists alike now recognize that environmental influences can modify an individual's genetic expression. Windows of opportunity for development. There is such a thing as a critical period, and we'll look at it through the lens of language development. So a critical period is the developmental age range in which certain experiences are required for a psychological or physical ability to develop. For example, it appears that exposure to human speech is necessary in the early years of life for typical language development. Let's consider the 1970s case of Jeannie, a child who was severely neglected and isolated to the point that she was rarely spoken to. Upon her rescue at age 13 years, Jeannie faced the monumental task of learning a language, a primary task, of course, that of infants and toddlers, with an adolescent or post-pubescent brain. Jeannie became the subject of intense study and remediation efforts by doctors, speech pathologists, and psychologists. Despite her extreme early deprivation, she made many improvements in language comprehension and speech production. A sensitive period describes an age range during which the development of a characteristic is particularly amenable to inputs and influences from the environment. For a critical period, certain experiences are necessary for normal development, whereas having certain experiences during a sensitive period make an advantageous situation for ideal development. Now let's look at the psychosocial theory of development. We'll spend more time with this later. We have Erik Erikson, who is pictured in figure 1.8 to the right, was born in Germany in the early 20th century and became a teacher and psychoanalyst. He worked with psychoanalyst Anna Freud as each practiced and strove to further Sigmund Freud's foundational theory of psychosexual development, which outlined a series of stages that children navigate in their personal development. Erikson called this a psychosocial theory of development, a discontinuous theory of development, to relate back to earlier slides, which views human development as occurring in those stages, or again, a stage-like fashion, as we resolve increasingly complex and age-graded challenges posed by the social environment. Let's look at his theory briefly. To the bullet points on the right, Erikson's theory was the first to consider the entire lifespan. A lot of Freud's ideas were focused on early childhood experiences from birth till about adolescence. The 8 stages of life he outlined now form one of the organizing frameworks for the study of lifespan development. In Erikson's view, as an individual enters each successive period of the lifespan, society presents a new challenge called a psychosocial crisis for the developing individual to work on. Let's look at these stages. Stage 1 occurs from 0 to 1 year. The developmental task here is trust versus mistrust. You're going to notice in each one, there's going to be a this versus that. So trust versus mistrust, the description, this is when an individual trusts or mistrusts that basic needs such as nourishment and affection will be met. With successful mastery, we will develop a sense of trust. In stage 2, occurring from 1 to 3, is the autonomy versus shame/doubt stage. Here, developing a sense of independence in many tasks is what our focus is on. Successful mastery will, of course, be autonomy. Stage 3, from 3 to 6 years of age, includes initiative versus guilt. This is where individuals will take initiative on some activities, but may develop guilt when unsuccessful or boundaries are overstepped. The successful mastery here includes initiative. Stage 4, from 7 to 11, includes industry versus inferiority. The description of this includes develop self-confidence and abilities when not competent, or a sense of inferiority when not. Successful mastery includes industry. Stage 5, from 12 to 18, is identity versus role confusion. To describe this stage, this is when we experiment with and develop identity and roles. Successful mastery includes identity in stage 6, from 19 to 29. This is where we experience intimacy versus isolation. We establish intimacy and relationship with others. Successful mastery, of course, is intimacy. In stage 7, we have ages 30 to 64, where the developmental task is generativity versus stagnation. We contribute to society and be a part of a family. Success includes generativity. And finally, stage 8, from 65 plus, includes integrity versus despair. To describe this stage, we assess and make sense of life and meaning of contributions. Successful mastery includes integrity. Let's look at some cognitive perspectives with regard to stage theory of cognitive development, famously contributed by Swiss biologist Jean Piaget. He's known for contributing theories regarding changes in cognitive ability that occur as we move from infancy to adulthood. When I say the word cognition in this class, you'll know that I'm referring to thinking or your thoughts. He developed his prominent stage theory of cognitive development, and Piaget's theory views development as occurring through a series of age-based stages. Again, discontinuous. Now let's look at his theory a little bit more in depth, Piaget's theory of cognitive development. From age 0 to 2, this first one is called sensory motor. To describe it, the world is experienced through senses and actions. And the developmental issue here includes object permanence as well as stranger anxiety. Object permanence is quite simply the understanding that just because something is out of our sight or it's covered up, this is when we know that it still exists. So during this stage, whenever we are experiencing object permanence or whenever we are not successful with object permanence, what happens is whenever an item is covered up or out of sight, it has gone into oblivion. It doesn't exist. Now from 2 to 6, we have what's known as the pre-operational stage. This is where we use words and images to represent things but lack logical reasoning. The developmental issue here includes pretend play, egocentrism, which is the difficulty in taking the perspective of others, as well as language development. From 7 to 11, we have the concrete operational stage. To describe it, it's when we understand concrete events and analogies logically, and we perform arithmetic operations. This includes items like conservation. Conservation is the understanding that just because something changes in its size, shape, or container, we know that it remains the same amount. Let's say, for example, I have 2 equal cups of water. They're completely see-through. You can see the exact amount of liquid in either cup. And let's say I bring in a skinny cylindrical cup that's a bit taller. I take one of those cups that are a bit wider and pour it into the tall, skinny cylindrical one. Now the water is going to be higher than the other water, of course. And if we ask a child who hasn't developed the concept of conservation yet, they're going to say that there's more water in the skinny cylindrical cup simply because the water's higher. And they don't understand the concept of conservation, where just because something changes in its size, shape, or container, it remains the same amount. Now from 12 plus, we have the formal operational stage. To describe this stage, we have formal operations and we utilize abstract reasoning. So the developmental issues here, of course, abstract logic, as well as moral reasoning. Let's look at some further cognitive perspectives, the socio-cultural theory of cognitive development. Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky explored learning and cognitive development in children during the early 20th century and demonstrated how important social interaction is for learning and growing. Vygotsky proposed a socio-cultural theory of cognitive development, emphasizing that thinking abilities are embedded within an individual's social and cultural context. Vygotsky is best known for championing social supports and propelling cognitive development and educational achievement. His notion of the zone of proximal development states that all of us are capable of thinking and achieving at a higher level than we may realize. There are concepts and ideas just beyond our current abilities that we are ready to master if only we have a little help, often from others. Educators and parents have used the idea of scaffolding to help learners achieve beyond their current level, gradually withdrawing support as the student becomes more competent. Learning how to ride a bicycle is a great example of scaffolding. Support for learning this difficult task can come through training wheels or from a caregiver holding the bicycle seat while running alongside the child. As the child gains a sense of balance and masters the mechanics of pedaling and steering, the training wheels become less necessary and are eventually removed, and the caregiver lets go of the seat. The child has reached a new level of development with guided and temporary support. Looking at biological and evolutionary perspectives, the study of animal behavior specifically is called ethology. Developmental psychologists who use this approach study animals, especially other mammals, as models to discover and test ideas relevant to understanding human functioning. The approach of evolutionary psychology looks to the theory of natural selection to explain the emergence, development, and persistence of various psychological characteristics in humans. The field of inquiry that most directly explores the intersection between nature and nurture is called behavioral genetics. Let's look at some behaviorist perspectives. Classical conditioning, aka learning from association, which helps us to anticipate events. We all are trained to learn from association. Marketers understand this concept well. When I say Red Robin, almost reflexively you think of yum. Is Red Robin yum? I'll let you be the judge of that. But when we take it a step further and we introduce classical conditioning, we learn to associate, but it helps us to anticipate events. Let's take into account the classic example of Pavlov's dog. Early in psychology's history as a science, Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov accidentally uncovered the principles that came to be known as classical conditioning. While studying the digestive system of dogs, Pavlov noticed that his experimental subjects, dogs, would often salivate even when he hadn't produced the meat powder that was meant to trigger their salivation. The dogs had come to associate the sound of a bell or a ticking metronome, which signaled the start of each experimental trial with impending food, and thus they would salivate when they heard the bell, even without the meat powder. Pavlov became curious about this and soon discovered the principles of classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, a neutral or meaningless stimulus, in the case of Pavlov's dogs, the sound of the bell, takes on the same meaning for the learner as the natural stimulus with which it is accidentally or intentionally paired, in this case, the meat powder. As a result, the previously neutral stimulus then produces the same behavioral outcome as the natural stimulus or unconditioned stimulus. For the natural stimulus, again, which has inherent meaning like the smell of food, is called an unconditioned stimulus, while the once neutral trigger is called a conditioned stimulus because the learner has become conditioned to respond to it, as you can see in figure 1.11 as an example. But let's say that I had an almighty power to control the weather, and I wanted to classically condition my students. We're in a room, starting a class on the first day, and I decide to snap my fingers 3 times. At that point, to you, the snapping of the fingers may get your attention momentarily, but it's more so neutral. It's a neutral reflex outside of just getting your attention for a brief moment. Now, let's say that neutral stimulus of me snapping my finger could cause a fear response in you. And you may be thinking to yourself, how in the world is that possible? Through a form of classical conditioning, I think it could be possible. Again, I have this almighty power to control the weather. And whenever I snap my fingers 3 times, 1, 2, 3, there's a loud thunderclap that happens right over our classroom. Now, humans are reflexively fearful of loud noises. Whenever I pair a neutral stimulus, like snapping my fingers 3 times, and just before that loud thunderclap happens, what you're going to know pretty quickly, because we're association machines, that when Mr. Poole snaps his finger 3 times, there's going to be a fear-provoking stimulus. That once neutral stimulus is now a conditioned stimulus. And if I were to bring in a control group to the class one day, and I snap my fingers 3 times, and then you all have the reflex, now conditioned reflex, of that there's about to be a thunderclap, so you crouch, you cover your ears, people are going to look at me like, what in the world has this man done for you? Because let's say that the thunderclap doesn't happen. They're looking at me now, man, this guy is out of his mind. What has he done to you with just him snapping his fingers? And that's just a form of classical conditioning. It may have been a bit too long of a story, but hopefully that puts it into more of context as well. Now let's look at operant conditioning. This is with B.F. Skinner, who uncovered fundamental principles of learning theory in the early 20th century. Skinner's studies built on Thorndike's law of effect, the philosophical idea that the consequences of an action tend to alter the frequency of the action. We're more likely to engage in something when it has a pleasant consequence, and we're less likely to engage in something that has a unpleasant or a neutral consequence. From this came the understanding of operant conditioning, and that's the theory of learning that outlines how feedback from the environment shapes an individual's behavior. Operant conditioning is learning from our consequences. Now, according to Skinner's operant conditioning theory, learning starts with an individual performing a behavior. The environment can then provide encouraging feedback called reinforcement, discouraging feedback in the form of punishment, or a neutral response, including ignoring the behavior. Now let's look at observational learning, because we don't just learn by things directly happening to us. Albert Bandura studied the principles of observational learning that explain how learning can occur through the social act of observing others who are themselves learning. First, his work recognized that humans are social animals. We live, learn, and develop within the presence of others, and we are influenced by and influence one another. Second, he demonstrated that the processes of classical conditioning and operant conditioning can guide learning. When we observe others' actions and the consequences of those actions, we learn too. Let's look at figure 1.12 to the left. Learning by viewing others can be powerful. Yoga students learn by observing as their instructor demonstrates the correct stance and movement for students, aka live models do not have to be physically present for the learning to occur. However, through symbolic modeling, this child can learn a behavior by watching someone demonstrate it on video. Going back to Bandura, it is likely through this class we will visit the Bobo doll experiment, where Bandura had individuals viewing somebody engaging with the Bobo doll. And whenever the model would be reinforced or punished as a result of the way they were engaging with the Bobo doll, that influenced how the individuals would then interact with the Bobo doll when it was their turn. You can find a video of it on YouTube, real footage of it. Now let's look at ecological systems model. Bronfenbrenner's original ecological systems model helped to rein in that complexity by providing a framework for understanding the various sources of influence on an individual's development. Let's firstly look at the macro system. This includes cultural beliefs and ideologies such as national politics, cultural values, and social conditions. The exosystem includes indirect influences that affect the individual, such as caregivers' workplace, local or regional politics, and the school board. One's mesosystem includes the interactions between microsystems such as parent-teacher communication and peer-to-school interactions. Now, the microsystem directly experienced by the individual, such as home environment, family, schools, peers, healthcare, faith community, as well as local playground. Now, the individual includes characteristics of the individual, such as their age, personality, and demographics. And the chronosystem changes over time and history, such as a pandemic, an economic crisis, or the creation of a new technology like smartphones, or now AI. The process of scientific research. We have what's known as deductive and inductive reasoning. Scientific knowledge is advanced through the scientific method. When we have a question, we have a hypothesis, we test that hypothesis, we analyze the results, and we come to a conclusion, and then report those findings. We have gone through the scientific method. They are tested against the real world in the form of empirical observations. Those empirical observations lead to more ideas that are tested against the real world, and so on. In this sense, the scientific process is a cycle of deductive and inductive reasoning. Researchers test ideas. In inductive reasoning, ideas are tested in the real world, whereas in inductive reasoning, real-world observations lead to new ideas. We have a hypothesis or general premise, and once we go from that to empirical observations and specific conclusions, that's deductive reasoning. And then when we go from the empirical observations and the specific conclusions to create more general premises or hypotheses, that is inductive reasoning. Now, let's define the difference, and most of us already know this, but really quickly, just as a refresh, define the difference between a theory as well as a hypothesis. Now, a theory is one of the highest honors you can get in science next to a law. A theory is not something that comes out of the blue. A theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena, whereas a hypothesis is a testable prediction about how the world will behave if our idea is correct. And it is worded often as an if-then statement. For example, if I study all night, I will get a passing grade on the test. And I want to really emphasize a hypothesis being a testable prediction. We grow up knowing that it's an educated guess, but it's a testable prediction. For a hypothesis to be legitimate, we have to be able to put the scientific method to it, it be observable, and it be considered empiricism, aka based on unbiased observations, as well as we can measure it, we can touch, feel, taste, sense it, measure it, and come to conclusions on. That's what makes it falsifiable, aka able to be proven supported or not supported by the scientific method. A hypothesis is a testable prediction, whereas a theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena. Now let's look at reliability and validity. For research to be trusted, it needs to be proven to be both reliable and valid. The ability to consistently produce a given result is referred to as reliability. Now, again, that is the consistency of the results, but for it to be valid, it needs to be supported by other researchers as well as peer-reviewed. Now, case studies and naturalistic observation, this is another form of study you can conduct in psychology in general, but also with lifespan development. In a case study, a great amount of detail is gathered about one or more individuals, a small group, to gain a thorough understanding of each person. At the end of a case study, we likely have a good sense of an individual's life and developmental history. Now, the downside is that the insight we've gleaned is often applicable only to the subject of the case. In other words, it does not have ecological validity because it does not generalize to people other than those being studied. To put it into simpler words, we can't take the information we've gained from a case study and generalize it among a population. We need a vast sum of individuals to prove that there is a statistical significance that we can generalize that information among a population. The research method of naturalistic observation is the observation of research participants in real-life settings. If you want to understand how behavior occurs, one of the best ways to gain information is to simply observe the behavior in its natural context. For instance, if we want to study whether older adults benefit from playing video games, we might start by observing older adults in the recreational areas of an assisted living facility. If you don't feel like you're being studied or like you're in a lab environment, then you're more likely to act your most natural self. Now let's look at correlation, how variables relate. The statistical technique used to determine the degree of relation or association between two or more variables is called correlation. When there's a relationship between variables, that is what we call a correlation. But an important factor to make note of here is that correlation does not equal causation. Just because the variables move in the same direction does not mean that they are inherently causal of one another. Now, a positive correlation means that the variables move in the same direction. When one goes up, the other goes up, and vice versa. When one goes down, the other goes down. The variables are moving in the same direction, so it'll make an incline from the left to the right of the graph. As height increases in figure A, typically so does weight. There's a positive correlation where the variables are moving in the same direction. If you look at figure B, we have a negative correlation. This is whenever the variables move in opposite directions. When one goes up, the other goes down. What you have here is a decline from left to right. Now, as the hours of sleep increase, as you can see, ideally what would happen is your tiredness levels are at their lowest. But as the hours of sleep decrease, your tiredness increases. The variables are moving in opposite directions. When it comes to your shoe size and hours of sleep, that's not going to have a correlation. It's just going to be dots around a screen, because we know that your shoe size does not have any sort of causal relationship or just a correlation in general with the hours of sleep that you have. So you'll see this kind of sprayed out version of the dots rather than a particular direction. What will happen often in a correlation is that if it's not inherently causal of one another, there's usually a third-party variable. And what I mean by that is, let's say that as ice cream sales increase, so do drowning deaths. That is a positive correlation that moves from left to right. As ice cream sales increase, so do drowning deaths. But does that mean that ice cream causes people to drown? No. What likely is going on is there's a third-party variable. When you think of what happens whenever it's hotter out, as well as with ice cream sales and drowning deaths, you put together that what's happening is that the numbers increase over the summer months because more people are eating a cold treat, as well as they are more often near bodies of water. That's how a correlation, just because there's a relationship, does not mean that they are inherently causal of one another. There is a third-party variable at play. Let's look at a longitudinal design studies a group of participants over a period of time, reassessing them at various points. Quite literally, the duration of the study is there in the word. A longitudinal design takes a long period of time to conduct. If we're interested in the development of friendships during adolescence, we might recruit a group of 50 sixth grade students. We will give them a personality inventory, collect background information about each, and ask them to complete surveys about their friendships. Then we would find these same 50 participants at 6-month or 1-year intervals, reassessing the same information at the end of 5 or 6 years. We'd have a rich data set and a really good idea about how the number, type, and quality of friendships change across adolescence. Given that some longitudinal studies take years, if not decades, to complete, the results will not be known for a considerable period of time. Research participants must also be willing to continue their participation for an extended period of time, and this can be problematic. People move on, get ill, and eventually die. Even without significant life changes, some people may simply choose to discontinue their participation in the project. This is known as attrition, the gradual loss or dropping out of participants from the original pool. Now let's look at a cross-sectional design. A cross-sectional design studies a group of participants of different ages, that is, multiple segments of the population at a given time. In our friendship example, researchers would identify a group of 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds, and 18-year-olds and assess them all on a variety of measures. Thus, they would have results suggesting the developmental progression of friendship type and quality across adolescence in a very short time, possibly a few months as opposed to 6 years. Attrition is not an issue, nor are practice effects, because all of the participants are recruited and assessed at just one point in time. One drawback of the cross-sectional approach is its inability to track individual development over a period of time. Let's take another quick example. We have a longitudinal study and a cross-sectional design. Let's say we're wanting to look at the effects of smoking since the age of 21. A longitudinal study would recruit an initial group of 30-year-olds and check in with them at, let's say, 40 years old and then 50 years old. That's like a 20-year-long study. And an issue with that 20-year-long study is going to be attrition. There's going to be people that drop out. Now, if we're wanting to do a cross-sectional study, that would take a lot less time because we could do it all in one swoop, where we recruit a group of individuals who have been smoking since the age of 21, a different group of 30-year-olds, a different group of 40-year-olds, and a different group of 50-year-olds. Now, the benefit of that is it takes less time, but the drawback, once again, is tracking individual development over that 20-year time span like you would get in a longitudinal study. Let's look at cross-sequential design. A cross-sequential design, sometimes called sequential design, combines the benefits of both cross-sectional and longitudinal designs. As in the cross-sectional design, groups of participants of different ages are recruited. However, instead of being assessed once, these participants are followed for a period of time, although usually much shorter than in a longitudinal study. Table 1.4 to the right summarizes the effectiveness of different research designs for studying different topics common in developmental psychology. Now let's look at ethics in psychology research. Any institution that receives federal support for research involving human participants must have access to an institutional review board, or usually shortened to IRB. The IRB is a committee of individuals often made up of members of the institution's administration, scientists, and community members. The purpose of the IRB is to review proposals for research that involves human participants. The IRB reviews those proposals with the preceding principles mentioned in mind, and generally approval from the IRB is required in order for the experiment to proceed. Now let's look at a more specific example to put it into real-world context with ethics. Ethics and the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Unfortunately, the ethical guidelines that exist for research today were not always applied in the past. Let's take into account in 1932, rural black men from Tuskegee, Alabama, were recruited to participate in an experiment conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service with the main aim of studying syphilis in black men. In exchange for free medical care, meals, and burial insurance, 600 men agreed to participate in the study. A little more than half of the men tested positive for syphilis, and they served as the experimental group. Given that the researchers cannot randomly assign participants to groups, this represents a quasi-experiment. The remaining syphilis-free individuals served as the control group. The experimental group receives the manipulated variable, and the control group does not receive the manipulated variable. They are simply the compare group. However, those individuals who tested positive for syphilis were never informed that they had the disease. While there was no treatment for syphilis when the study began, by 1947, penicillin was recognized as an effective treatment for the disease. Despite this, no penicillin was administered to the participants in this study, and the participants were not allowed to seek treatment at any other facilities if they continued in the study. Over the course of 40 years, many of the participants unknowingly spread syphilis to their spouses and sexual partners, and subsequently children born from those relationships. And many participants eventually died because they never received treatment for the disease. This study was discontinued in 1972 when the experiment was discovered by the national press. The resulting outrage over the experiment led directly to the National Research Act of 1974 and strict ethical guidelines for research on humans. Now let's look at research using animal subjects. Many psychologists conduct research involving animal subjects. Often these researchers use rodents, as you can see in figure 1.2, or birds as the subjects of their experiments. The APA estimates that 90% of all animal research in psychology uses these species, because many basic processes in animals are sufficiently similar to those in humans. These animals are often considered acceptable substitutes for research that would be considered unethical in human participants. This does not mean, though, that animal researchers are immune to ethical concerns. Indeed, the humane and ethical treatment of animal research subjects is a critical aspect of this type of research. Researchers must design their experiments to minimize any pain or distress experienced by animals serving as research subjects. This will conclude Chapter 1 of OpenStax Lifespan Development. I appreciate you getting to the end of this video, and I hope to see you in the next one for Chapter 2. Have a good rest of your day, and thank you to OpenStax for providing this free resource for students. Bye-bye.